wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic podcast, where we discuss ancient philosophy and how it applies to modern life. I'm Dan Monks of Queens, New York City, and today I'm joined by...
Steve Caravit in Howard, Ohio.
So in today's episode, Steve and I will be discussing Stoicism as it relates to diet and in particular vegetarianism. We will discuss vegetarianism in particular because it has long been a controversy within the online Stoic community, debating whether vegetarianism or even veganism is mandatory for Stoicism. And many people do argue that ancient Stoics were in fact vegetarian. So first we will explore what the ancient Stoics had to say about food and diet, and then we will explore whether what the ancients advocated for has any bearing or impact on our dietary choices in the 21st century. Perhaps we would start out with Marcus Aurelius. When we have meat before us or other dishes, we receive the impression that this is but the carcass of a fish, this of a fowl, and the other of a pig. And then, for this bottle of Falernian wine is but a little grape juice. Think of your purple robes as sheep's wool stained in the blood of a shellfish. Such then are these impressions, and they reach the things themselves and penetrate them. And so we see what kind of things they are. Just in the same way we ought to act all through life. And where there are things which appear most worthy of our approbation, we ought to lay them bare, and look at their worthlessness and strip them of all the words by which they are exalted. For outward show is a wonderful perverter of the reason. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, Book 6.13. So, what do you take from that, Steve?
Well, partially what we see here is, what do we call that? Decomposition?
Yeah, physical definition or decomposition.
Where we look at something and we break it down, try to rip the veneer off of it, all the fancy hype that we layer on top of reality. And so, well, this is not a purple robe. It's some wool dyed in the blood of a shellfish, right? That really changes the way you look at it.
Some folks might not know out there that purple in Roman times was the most expensive color, and it was reserved for the senatorial class and the emperor. So if you wore purple, it was a big deal, and it could inflate your ego. So he was trying to point out that the way you make this is just take sheep's wool and then you dye it with the blood of a shellfish. You could see it for what it really was.
And Romans were often well known, especially, emperors and whatnot, for having lavish feasts with all kinds of strange fare, like, peacock. And I just know mostly of them making fun of it on Monty Python movies, where they're like aardvark snout, fried chicken toes, or whatever, just weird delicacies. And he's saying, if you take all this fancy food that people make a big deal of and you break it down to, this is just the meat of a dead pig,
which has been prepared in a certain way and it has fancy spices on it.
Yeah, and so you take away its mystique a little bit rather than making it something to lust after, or, as we'll see later in Epictetus, toning it down so it's not something you're really reaching for when you ought not be so worried about it. There are simpler ways to find something to eat.
Right, it's an external, and it's important to view it as an indifferent, and it helps to cultivate temperance. And one other thing to note in here is that I take from this that it's unlikely that Marcus Aurelius was a vegetarian, because he feels the need to remind himself that these fancy dishes of fish, fowl, and pig are what they are. And that means that he views them as desirable. And if he was a vegetarian, I know from experience and from the experience of others that he wouldn't have to remind himself that they aren't desirable if he was a vegetarian, because he would not be craving them.
Right. Although I did know a vegetarian who finally broke down and ate a hot dog because he was craving it from the smell so much. And I thought, of all things to give up your diet for, a hot dog? But hey, to each their own.
I went vegan for many years, and there was only one time where I was seriously tempted by meat, and it was because I was driving home from work, and it was early in the morning, and I was driving past a park in my neighborhood, and Law and Order was filming in this park. And because they were filming there, they had their like breakfast buffet, and they were
Okay.
cooking massive amounts of bacon.
Ha!
And it was right alongside where I was driving, and my windows were down, and the smell of bacon came through my window, and I was like, "Wow, I'd really like some bacon about now." And that was the only time I remember seriously craving meat since I went vegan and later vegetarian.
I could see Bacon doing that actually, yeah. But he's laying out all this stuff that people are craving and things that a lot of people couldn't afford, like fancy wine and all this. And if I remember right, they say that Zeno mostly ate like honey and figs and things that were easy to find.
And loaves of bread.
Yeah, stuff that and there was a story about him with lentil soup.
Well, that was during his training as a Cynic philosopher at the time. Crates.
I've also cooked what they call Zeno's lentil soup, or which is a recipe you can find online. It's pretty good. It's vegetarian, of course, vegan if I remember correctly, but quite good, quite hearty.
I should look that up.
If I remember, maybe when we post this episode, I can put a link to that recipe in the show description. That way, everyone can find that recipe.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
Part of the idea with Zeno, I think, was the way to eat philosophically is to eat what's in season and what's easy and easy to get, not something you have to strive and work hard for and waste time on.
Right. Things that are close to hand, things that are affordable, and things that are easy to prepare.
That way you can eat to live rather than live to eat. And now we'll hear from Seneca. I became a vegetarian, and by the time a year had gone by, was finding it enjoyable as well as an easy habit. I was beginning to feel that my mind was more active as a result of being vegetarian. Seneca, letter 108.
So I read up on this, and elsewhere in the letter, he says that he abandoned vegetarianism at the request of his father because his father was concerned that Seneca would be thought to be a member of some controversial religious groups.
Yeah, that we're also vegetarian, if I remember
Right.
correctly.
He didn't want, because he was vegetarian, and he didn't want him to go to a social gathering, exhibit vegetarian habits, and be thought to be a member of these groups that were out of favor. So Seneca was persuaded to abandon his vegetarianism. And I read elsewhere, and he points out that he pursued vegetarianism because of his enthusiasm for philosophy that he was studying at the time. And I read somewhere that it was Pythagoreanism, and they apparently were vegetarians. So this habit predates his time as a Stoic. So once again, he was vegetarian for a period of time in his life, but it was before he was a Stoic, and therefore there's no evidence that his vegetarianism was tied to his Stoicism in any way.
Yeah, and I don't think he brings it up a whole lot more after that, but I have not read everything Seneca put out there at this time, but I am a fan of
He wrote a lot.
a lot of his essays. But he did. He is the one we have a lot of writings from and plays and everything else. And then Epictetus.
Remember that you must behave as at a banquet. Is anything brought round to you? Put out your hand and take a moderate share. Does it pass by you? Do not stop it. Is it not yet come? Do not yearn and desire toward it, but wait till it reaches you. Epictetus, Enchiridion 15.
And God makes one animal for eating, and another for service in farming, another to produce cheese, and others for different uses. Epictetus Discourses, Book 1.6. So, what do you get from that first one, Dan? Obviously, moderation is part of it.
Yes, I think he's emphasizing that you need to operate with a certain amount of decorum and restraint and behave well in regards to food so you can demonstrate temperance.
I think that it kind of goes back to what I said earlier about like Zeno eating what was easily available. You don't stress yourself out and work hard towards externals that you don't really need, because if you're trying to strive for that big fat pig with the apple in its mouth, you got to work your butt off to afford that to try to show off where you could have just had some figs and honey for almost nothing and been on your way to study philosophy more thoroughly rather than working to afford that pig.
Or if you want to get invited to the banquet where it's thrown by someone else
and they're going to serve you that pig, then you might be obligated to that person in some way that might compromise you.
Yeah, Epictetus was big on that one about being careful not to get yourself in a web of obligations
Yeah, to
by
people that are morally suspect.
exactly. And then in the second one, though, we see that he doesn't say God forbids you to eat meat. He says God makes an animal for eating and one for farming, another one to make cheese. There's a whole, I mean, so first of all, veganism's definitely out there, and he's got cheese and meat in that same sentence. But I don't know. I don't recall Epictetus saying a whole lot about like here's what you should eat. I think Musa, as we'll see, I think his teacher had a little more to say about it.
Yeah, Musonius Rufus had stronger opinions about that. But yeah,
Hmm.
Epictetus was kind of silent on that, at least in the surviving discourses.
Yeah. Who knows what he said that doesn't exist anymore? But
Right. And his attitude toward animals, that they're there for our use, kind of ties in a lot with their hierarchical view of the universe, like where base matter, like rocks and earth and water and stuff, had one tension of pneuma, and then you had a higher tension in plants, and then a even higher tension in animals, and then even higher tension in humans, because we had the rational faculty. We can make a proper use of sense impressions. And then above everybody, of course, was the gods or God. But I think that's where we get because we are in a higher placement in this hierarchy, everything below us is supposed to serve us. Maybe that was a fine way to view the universe back in the day before we were catapulting ourselves along into global warming and environmental collapse. But
right,
times have changed. That old view has taken us into some pretty destructive territory, and I think it's time we start thinking of
right,
ourselves as stewards instead of rulers of the
yeah.
natural world.
Yeah, there was a hierarchical view of like the ladder of creation. And of course, humans were near the top of the ladder with the gods above them, and everything else was below humans. So we could make use of those however we saw
At
fit.
our
It
will.
was, yeah, although the Stoics do kind of emphasize that we are part of nature, whereas, a lot of more modern thinking, at least pre scientific modern thinking, was kind of push the idea that we were apart from nature.
Yeah, that's more to do with the Platonic view of the world, where God was separate from the universe and created the universe and kind of controls it like a mechanism or a puppet show kind of thing.
Right, right.
Whereas for Stoics, God is the universe and is physics and cause and effect and all that stuff.
Yeah, and even all as you said, the pneuma, which is sort of kind of translates as breath or spirit. Different levels of this hierarchy had different, as they said, tensions of this pneuma, and of course, humans had a strong tension, which made us, a little more like Zeus than say a plant. We have stronger powers of reason and things like that. But still, it is kind of interesting that they had this idea that we did all share in some form of this pneuma, which is kind of a connection of all living things. And even rocks, if I remember correctly, had some form of it as well. But
Right, where they were the lowest tension.
yeah, but Epictetus doesn't say a lot about it other than don't entangle yourself into doing unjust things to acquire your food or getting hitching your wagon, your moral wagon to a corrupt individual by accepting their banquets or by becoming gluttonous. As we'll see, Musonius Rufus, who was a mentor of Epictetus, he actually wrote a whole essay
He wrote two of them.
on food.
Well,
Or yeah,
remember,
actually, yeah.
these kind of like Epictetus, the things we have from Musonius Rufus were actually written down by two of his students in the same way that the discourses were written out as kind of summaries of what Musonius Rufus told them in class, or actually after class.
Dan, you want to tackle this Musonius?
Sure.
On the subject of food, Musonius Rufus used to speak frequently, and very emphatically too, as a question of no small significance, nor leading to unimportant consequences. Indeed, he believed that the beginning and foundation of temperance lay in self control in eating and drinking. As one should prefer inexpensive food to expensive, and what is abundant to what is scarce, so one should prefer what is natural for men to what is not. Now, food from plants of the earth is natural to us. Grains and those which, though not cereals, can nourish man well, and also food other than flesh from animals which are domesticated. Of these foods, the most useful are those which are most easily available. For example, fruits in season, vegetables, milk, cheese, and honey. On the other hand, Musonius Rufus argued that meat was a less civilized kind of food and more appropriate for wild animals. He held that it was a heavy food and an obstacle to thinking and reasoning, since the exhalations rising from it being turbid darkened the soul. For this reason, the people who make larger use of meat seem slower in intellect.
Musonius Rufus on Food, Lecture 18a. Musonius here is advocating for a particular type of diet, unlike the other folks who are largely silent on the issue of vegetarianism. He advocates for just eating vegetables, fruit, milk, cheese, and honey.
Yeah, as you said, vegetables that are easy to find and animal products that don't involve
Slaughtering.
slaughtering the animal, right?
Yeah, he doesn't specifically list eggs, but I imagine that he would include eggs as being okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny how he talks about how meat slows the mind, and Seneca kind of says something similar as well.
I actually have memory from when I first became vegan many years ago, where I'd say 10 days in or so, I noticed that was suddenly more alert. And I kind of liken it to, have you ever gone through a period where you went through sleep deprivation for, like, say, a week and you were kind of like a zombie? Do you remember that? And then
Yeah, I've had.
and then you get like a solid night's sleep, and then you wake up and all of a sudden the world seems brighter and more vibrant. It was kind of like that, but it was continuous, because usually that sensation of getting that good night's sleep will wear off within 4 or 5 hours of you waking up. But the veganism mental alertness, it lasted for days and days, and it did become normal eventually, so I didn't notice it anymore. But I think it actually is a thing, and I've heard it from other people as
Mhm.
well. I don't know whether it's still operational in me now that I've dialed it back to vegetarianism, but
Right.
veganism, it definitely worked for me.
The reading from Musonius one of the things I remember the most is this reading here. I'm going to do it real quick just because it's one that I think of, especially when I overeat. And that is, pleasure in eating is probably the hardest pleasure to combat. For other pleasures we encounter less often, and we can refrain from some of them for months and whole years. But of necessity, we are tempted by the pleasure of food every day. The more often we are tempted by pleasure in eating, the more dangers there are involved. And indeed, at each meal, there is not one hazard in going wrong, but many. Musonius Rufus, On Food, Lecture 18b. So that one I just found to be very true. And I think a lot of people say that how you eat is a great test of your temperance, because if you can master how you eat, then you are probably well on your way to having the willpower or the right mindset to tackle other areas in life. Because first of all, food is such a primal thing to want, but also we have the opportunity to eat uh, at least, usually 3 meals a day, and you can mess up at any one of those meals. You can eat too quickly, you can eat the wrong things, you can eat too much, you can spend too much, you can go wrong in a number of ways. You can forget your good manners and act like an animal or whatever. I'm sure there's a number of ways that he means when he says there are many ways to go wrong at each meal.
In fact, he does address that directly.
The man who eats more than he ought does wrong, and the man who eats in undue haste no less, and also the man who wallows in the pickles and the sauces, and the man who prefers the sweeter foods to the more healthful ones, and the man who does not serve food of the same kind or amount to his guests as to himself.
Musonius Rufus on Food, Lecture 18b. So yeah, that's exactly what you were talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And so Musonius, I also think of that one when I'm adding sriracha to something. I'm like, oh, Musonius Rufus is gonna get mad.
He's gonna frown on you.
Yeah, because if I remember right, is it Musonius or somebody, one of the other Stoics or Musonius talked about, oh, they add vinegar to their foods, like
Scandalous.
scandalous, like, oh, if you have to spice, like hunger is supposed to be the best spice, right? From a Stoic perspective. And so if you need to add hot sauce and vinegar and whatever else, then perhaps you're doing it wrong. But I'm still gonna do a little bit of that. I won't lie.
Yeah, I'm a 21st century Stoic, and I'm going to be having my vinegar
Right.
and my salt.
But to be fair, I think we have to spend way less of our income or proportions of our income on some of these spices than perhaps a Roman would have to, because some of those things would probably be quite expensive and luxurious in the days when horseback spices are being carried by horseback from
Or ship.
thousands of miles.
Right.
But still, we should think about that and eat in moderation. Remember to have our manners. And you can see that justice shows up in here too. If you're having the filet mignon while everyone else gets served spam at your dinner party, then perhaps you are not being just in that sense. He's saying to eat what's easy to get, that's healthful. I eat vegetarian meals now and again, but I have never. Heck, for Christmas every year, I get a quarter. A lot of times, I get a quarter of beef from my brother as a present because he raises cattle. But I do like the idea of, like, I try to make a vegetarian meal or vegan meal every now and again, and I try to cut down and eat mostly vegetables and have meat as a side item, which I think it's easier to do that. It was easier for me to do that when I didn't have a child that was also eating and is picky, and I gotta cook stuff for him, and I'm not gonna make myself a whole separate meal, so I end up eating
Chicken
what
nuggets.
he has a lot of the time. So well, luckily, I we've moved a little bit out of the chicken nugget
Oh, thank
phase.
goodness. Two more quotes that I'd like to get to before we wrap things up.
One should, by constant practice, accustom himself to choosing food not for enjoyment, but for nourishment, not to tickle his palate, but to strengthen his body. Musonius Rufus on Food, Lecture 18b.
And
To sum up the question of food, I maintain that its purpose should be to produce health and strength, that one should for that purpose eat only that which requires no great outlay, and finally that at table one should have regard for a fitting decorum and moderation.
Musonius Rufus on Food, Lecture 18b.
So if we're gonna sum up Masonius here, I'd say it's eat simply and be just in how you do things, and
Operate with decorum and restraint and temperance.
there you go.
And in his case, that seems to be general advice across Stoicism. But in Musonius's case, he does advocate for vegetarianism, specifically
Right.
specifically what today we would call the ovo-lacto diet, where you can have eggs and cheese and stuff.
And what do you think, Dan? What about the modern Stoic? What should they do? How should they approach this?
In a general sense, just what they were saying, that you should eat simple and readily available foods that don't require an extraordinary amount of money or preparation, and stick to well, in the modern sense, stick to natural foods as much as possible and avoid ultra processed foods, because those tend to be unhealthy, obviously.
Even better if you can eat something that was grown near you that didn't have to travel across the world to get to you. I hate to cut down on all the amazing options we have out there, but it depends. It kind of depends on where your circles of concern lie. Are you eating to save the world? Or are you eating to promote local well-being? I guess some of it kind of depends on how you're approaching things.
Yeah, there are arguments that could be made that whilst vegetarianism and veganism is not mandatory for Stoicism, it's definitely consistent with it, especially if you value being just in the world, in the sense that you minimize your impact on the environment, because the production of meat requires a lot of natural resources in terms of feed and oil to move the meat around, and also water for cleaning the meat and feeding the animals while they're alive.
Sure. And if you're going to eat meat, I would suggest you at least watch some documentaries about what factory farming entails, so you know what you're supporting. Or if let's say you watch that and you don't want to be vegetarian, but you don't want to support that, then you might realize that you should be spending $15 a chicken from your local farmer's market instead of buying something cheaper from the grocery store, something that had a life more like a life of a wild,
An actual chicken.
slightly wild animal. Yeah, an actual chicken. So these are things you should weigh out. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you shouldn't put blinders on. Putting blinders on and pretending ignorant so you don't have to feel bad is not the philosophical way to go. You should be aware of what you're doing and make intentional choices based on your sense of morality and your implementation of the virtues. Dan, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I think it would be good to address why I chose this topic this week. Everything in life, every event and choice, is the product of a confluence of preceding events and choices. In the early 2000s, I injured my back. It hurt pretty badly for a few weeks, and then it subsided, but it was always prone to re-injury and gradually got worse over the years until one day it hit me so acutely that I could not walk for more than a few hundred feet without excruciating pain. So, for the next couple years when I wasn't hobbling into work, I spent all my time lying on the couch and trying not to move. Just the act of sitting up in bed would cause severe pain. And after a couple years of that, lying on the couch and being depressed and eating to try and compensate, my weight, which had always been a challenge for me, got way out of control. Then my doctor told me that my blood test results were not good. I realized that my path was not tenable. By that time, I had rediscovered Stoicism, and it was proving useful in many ways, including giving a framework for action. I looked at the various choices open to me, and decided that veganism was my best option. It was difficult for a couple weeks, but then I felt much better, and experienced that prolonged feeling of energetic, vibrant alertness that I mentioned earlier. My doctor tested my blood again, and the elimination of animal products had completely reversed the negative blood markers. Over the years since then, my weight has dropped significantly, but I still have a long, hard road ahead of me. Eventually, I dialed my veganism back to be ovo-lacto-vegetarianism. Veganism was proving too stressful for the people in my life. For family gatherings and other social settings, folks have a much easier time accommodating ovo-lacto-vegetarianism as opposed to veganism. Recently, my weight loss plateaued. After a few months of hovering in the same range, I decided to take stock of what was going on. So, this week I re-examined what the ancient Stoics advised on the topic of food choice and looked at what I was doing in the present. I realized that where I have been going wrong is that I have become lax in regard to consuming ultra-processed foods. I eat positive things for the most part, but too often I have been eating things like potato chips and having a soda. That might technically fall within vegetarianism, but that doesn't mean it's a healthy decision. Speaking of the founder of Stoicism, Musonius Rufus said, "Zeno thought he ought to beware of delicacy in diet, and not yield to it in the least. For if he once yielded, he would go the whole way, since in the matter of food and drink, pleasure accelerates its pace alarmingly." Musonius Rufus on Food, Lecture 18a. Zeno was right. I had yielded intermittently at first, but things had gotten out of hand, and I have been indulging too much. I attribute my weight loss plateau to that backsliding. Consequently, I will enact a strict ban on ultra-processed foods, and I expect that things will begin moving in the correct direction again. Please let us know whether any of you have implemented vegetarianism or veganism, and if so, whether you also experience sensations of increased energy and mental alertness. Unfortunately, being an internal state, I don't think there would be many options for testing this scientifically. But I experienced it, and both Seneca and Musonius Rufus wrote about it, so I suspect it's real. Please send your anecdotes on this subject to sundaystoic@gmail.com.
So get out there, eat well. Bon appetit. Email us your questions or concerns, sundaystoic@gmail.com. Enjoy your week, eat well, and don't forget to seize the day.
Carpe diem!